How's it going, everybody? You're with Rafa, the Pickleball Tech Dude, and today we're going to talk about a power paddle that I think is going to seriously fly under the radar for most players. This is the Chorus Phoenix, and if you caught the relationship between this paddle's name and that of Chorus's previous power paddle, kudos to you. Stemming from the delisting of the Chorus Fire, Chorus Pickleball's original power paddle, the Phoenix, in their own words, rises from the ashes. The Phoenix originally launched earlier this month in just a hybrid shape, but as of today, the lineup will include a standard, hybrid, and elongated shape, in Chorus's typical naming convention, SX, HX, and EX. The Phoenix comes out to under $170 after discount code RAFA, but there's an important caveat here to mention. As of this recording, the Phoenix HX model in particular has a PB core value of 0.44, meaning that it is set to be delisted by May 1st of 2026. Chorus already has a plan for this though. They'll be offering 0.43 approved paddles in the HX model very soon, and anybody who purchases the paddle in its current state will be allowed to purchase that model for anywhere from $0 to $70 based on where you are in the warranty period. To give a brief disclosure, Chorus did not incentivize me in any way to do this review, and using my affiliate code does provide me a small kickback. However, the best way to support the channel always is just to watch the videos, be subscribed, and of course, encourage people who aren't subscribed to go ahead and do so. To get into the construction of this paddle, we're dealing with what Chorus is calling their singularity core. What we're dealing with is a polypropylene core in a 14mm thickness with slightly wider than average 10mm cells, completely surrounded by a very thin layer of EVA foam, making this technically a floating core paddle, but having a much thinner foam channel than other floating core Gen 3s like the 11624 powers. The face layup is a carbon fiber, fiberglass, carbon fiber, or CFC sandwich layup, and Chorus is using what they are calling soft carbon in these layers, which will come up again in a moment. What originally got me excited about the Phoenix paddles, if we look at the stats on paper for the SX and HX first, is that they have a high level of power, very high level of spin, and very low swing weights for their shape sizes. Things get a little bit less exciting as we move towards the newly released EX shape, as we see the balance point shifted up and the swing weight going much more in line with what you would expect with an elongated paddle. Now, with stats and construction out of the way, let's talk about how this paddle feels at all three parts of the court and how I would rank each of the shape's performance. Overall, when you're talking ball feel, this paddle does lean much more responsive than it does muted and have a more stiffer, crisp feel off the face as opposed to one that's more plush. So think very much along the lines of a Paddletek Bantam. At the baseline is where you're going to have the most fun with this paddle, because with little to no thought, the ball is going to go over the net pretty much every single time, and it's going to do so with a pretty high degree of power and a very good shape to it due to the spin. Despite technically being a floating core Gen 3, the ball doesn't really sit and dwell on the face like we see with a lot of other paddles constructed this way. Where I think the spin really comes from is the nice textured grit on the paddle, as well as the maneuverability, which really allows you to whip over the ball. Because these paddles are thinner and lighter, without weight, you can feel like your paddle's being pushed around a little bit, especially receiving a heavy return on the baseline. So these are the weight setups that I preferred for all three shapes to reduce that, but I very much preferred the feeling of the plow through on the EX and HX in comparison to the SX. As we transition into the mid-court for resets, this is really an area where none of these paddles really performed very strongly. The sweet spot in the Phoenix paddles is tighter than comparable floating core Gen 3s and than powerful Gen 4s really, other than the Body Helix Flick F1. However, that doesn't mean the sweet spot is small. Especially with the weight setups I've suggested, the sweet spot does feel more along the average lines and is much larger even stock compared to the paddle that I think it feels most comparable to, which again is the Paddletek Bantams. What that means for resets is that it's really easy to tell when you've hit a good one versus a bad one, which is always positive, especially as you're trying to move towards the kitchen line. But that doesn't mean that it's easy to hit resets. These paddles are incredibly poppy, and it makes receiving any kind of ball with pace very difficult for anybody who is under a 4.0 to 4.5 level. Looking at a combination of sweet spot size and length, I much prefer the HX in this area and prefer the EX the least. So now we've established a pattern. At the baseline, a lot of your input goes into the ball. As you get to the transition zone and in the midcourt, you do need to reduce a lot of your own input and loosen your grip. And as you get to the kitchen is really where you need to allow this paddle to do most of the work. Due to the poppy nature of the paddle, dinks can be really easily popped up. However, for pretty much everything else, flicks, rolls, or being really maneuverable and crafty with your shot placement on dinks, this paddle felt really, really good. I typically prefer standard shape paddles at the kitchen line, and in this case, the SX was a very, very close second. But for me, with the HX having such a low swing weight in comparison to other hybrid paddles, and still allowing you to have more length to reach more flicks and rolls, I ended up surprisingly preferring the hybrid shape. And rest assured, if you get on top of a ball in any way, shape, or form at the kitchen line, it is very rare to see it come back. There's only a handful of paddles I've ever hit with, some of which have now been banned for pro play, where I felt that it's necessary to apologize for body bagging from the kitchen line or getting on top of an overhead that hits somebody, and this definitely goes on that list. Awesome. So with everything that we've now talked about, how does this paddle actually stack up to the competition, and who do I actually recommend it to? First and foremost, if you're looking to move to a paddle to give you much more control and lower margin for error, this is definitely not that paddle. Secondly, if what you're chasing is a more muted or plush ball feel experience, this is also definitely not the right paddle. There are plenty of others in a similar price range that can get you that sensation, like the SLK Eras, the 11624 Power and Alpha Pro Powers, the Bread and Butter Loco, or even the Honolulu J2 NF and FC Plus. Really, how I would describe this paddle is the Paddletek Bantam killer. Looking at the pros and why so many of them choose to use the Paddletek Bantam, it's because of that ability to feel the ball on every single shot, know exactly when you've hit the sweet spot and when you've missed it. And that's very important when you're trying to get the level of precision that they are. And that is definitely something that this paddle offers. But one of the main reasons recreationally why I see so many people turn away from the Bantams is because of the very, very tight sweet spot, which a pro can obviously hit much more consistently. With the Phoenix, you get much more forgiveness and a much larger sweet spot, even stock, which make this paddle feel significantly better and easier to use. So if you're a fan of these types of poppy, powerful paddles that are also thin cord, making them very maneuverable and easy to feel the ball, such as, again, the Paddletek Bantams or even the Holbrook Arma, the Phoenix is definitely worth a look, especially due to the variety of the shapes in the lineup, and because they're over $50 cheaper than the Bantams and over $100 cheaper than the Arma. The one advantage that paddles like the Bantams or the Armas do have over the Phoenix, and I will say this only applies to some of the paddles in those lineups, is dual certification for UPA and USAP. That really only matters if you're really playing PPA Tour at the higher levels, such as Challenger or even Pro qualifiers where your paddles are actually being tested. Everything else goes by USAP rules, but it's just something I did want to note. And that is going to wrap my synopsis here on the Phoenix. While I hit it during August, it was one of, if not the paddle that I had the most fun with during that time. And so, of course, is definitely worth a look, in my opinion, if you fall into one of the buckets that we just discussed. But with all that said, thank you so much for watching. If you made it here to the end, make sure you're liking and subscribing once again to support me and support the channel the most. And I hope you all stay happy and healthy and, of course, out on the courts. And I'll see you real soon. Peace.